Hey guys, Jay Steven here, and I'm going to do a podcast about the movie Kingdom of Heaven, kind of revisiting it in a way. And in it, I'm just going to go over 5 key points in the film that I think are the main historical problems with it. And I hope that some people will find this useful. Okay, the first major flaw with this movie involves the attitudes of the characters themselves. The characters in Kingdom of Heaven, as a lot of historians have pointed out, express profoundly unmedieval ideas. They don't think like medieval people. They think like postmodern people, really, especially when it comes to ideas of religion and ideas of religious tolerance. And of course, the idea of religious tolerance did not exist in the medieval world. It's a postmodern idea, the idea of religious pluralism. For medieval people, religion was very much a public thing as well as a private thing. You had your personal spirituality, but your religion was directly related to your public identity, to your the society that you lived in. And medieval people very much believed that for a society to be properly ordered, it had to have the right alignment religiously, because the most important thing was God. And if you turned your back on God, then your society was going to really have serious problems. So we're going to take a look at some of the characters here. First of all, the main character, Balian of Ibelin, who is a highly fictionalized version of the actual Balian of Ibelin. The true Balian of Ibelin, of course, was not a blacksmith. He was a high-born nobleman who grew up in the kingdom of Jerusalem in this region called Outremer, which was the Crusader states established by the First Crusade. And in the movie, he has the word that always came to my mind when watching the film was emo attitude, and a very skeptical attitude toward religion. He openly mocks religion on several occasions. There's one part of the scene where something catches on fire, and he makes a joke about the burning bush as if it's absurd. He says things like, "Oh, God doesn't know me. I can't connect with God. I don't feel God's presence." He questions the whole idea of the crusade in much the same way that a writer for the New York Times today might question it. And of course, this is all crazy because Balian of Ibelin was a very typical medieval Latin Christian of the time. He was very devout. He was quite devoted to a number of saints. He absolutely believed in the cause of the Crusades, the idea of winning back the Holy Land and winning back, territory from the Muslims that had previously been Christian. He didn't see anything wrong with this. In fact, all evidence points to the fact that he saw this as the highest good. We get a similar attitude from the princess in the movie, Sibylla. She's kind of portrayed as agnostic or totally disenchanted by the concept of crusading. In truth, this would have been her heritage. She was the daughter of a great crusader king. This would have been something she very much believed in. Saladin gets a similar treatment. He's kind of treated as a reluctant holy warrior. He really wishes that he seems to have this longing for tolerance and pluralism among the Christians and Muslims. He's just goaded into going to war with the Christians because of the bad actions of certain crusaders. This isn't true at all. Saladin was a dedicated jihadist. His biographer, Bahauddin, even talks about how Saladin expressed a desire to, once he eliminated all of the crusader holdings in Syria and Palestine, he wanted to go overseas, that is to Europe, and attack the Christians there. And as Bahauddin put it, eliminate everyone who does not believe in Allah. So a similar attitude was held by King Baldwin IV, the leper king of Jerusalem. Again, in this movie, he's portrayed as kind of a pluralistic sort of person. He tells Balian of Ibelin at one point, make sure especially that you defend the Muslims and the Jews, not just because it's expedient, but because it's right. Well, I mean, this is not consistent with the historical King Baldwin IV. Baldwin IV was a dedicated crusader. He wanted to defeat the Muslims decisively. In fact, he came of age at a time when there had been a rather lengthy truce between the Muslims and the Crusaders, and he opposed that truce and took the fight to Saladin pretty hard early on. engaging in raids on Muslim territory. He ended up defeating Saladin in a very spectacular victory at the Battle of Montgisard in 1177, at which he expressed very deep religious ideas and expressed a desire to basically stand between Saladin and stand between Saladin and Jerusalem and take the brunt of the infidels' attack. He was someone who was devoted to the idea of protecting Christians, and he certainly, like all medieval rulers, he would have, respected the rights of the Muslims living in his kingdom, just as Saladin would have respected the rights of the Christians living in his. But he certainly would never have told a knight to have some sort of special concern for protecting Jews and Muslims because it's somehow especially moral. I mean, that is such a postmodern attitude. That's the kind of thing that somebody in the West today would express because they have these feelings of guilt about. So therefore, they think that they need to somehow have more concern for the other than for their own. But I mean, such an attitude just did not exist in the medieval world. This was a period of time when rulers gave preferential treatment to the citizens of their own religion. The highest ranking people in the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem were Latin Christians, so Catholic Christians. There were a lot of Eastern Christians who lived in the Kingdom of Jerusalem as well, and a lot of them had fairly high status, and they were allowed to practice their faith, and a lot of them had important roles in the kingdom. But still, the absolute highest status was held by those people that shared the religion of the ruling class, the Catholics, the Latin Christians. Just as in Saladin's kingdom, Sunni Muslims had the highest status. And our next character I think I want to look at is this Hospitaller Knight, who is one of the most bizarre characters in Kingdom of Heaven. He is Balian of Ibelин's kind of sidekick sort of character. He's there to sort of impart wisdom, and his wisdom is always about tolerance and how, bad the Crusades have been. And, it would be really the thing that we should have more of is religious tolerance, which is a crazy attitude from someone who's a member of one of the monastic military orders of the Middle Ages. The Templars and the Hospitallers were deeply devoted to the Crusades and the cause of the Crusade, and that's why they joined it in the first place. But even beyond that, the sort of attitudes this Hospitaller expresses just would not have been possible or would not have existed in the medieval world. It's just totally out of place. The second major issue, I think, with this movie is the political dynamic between the Kingdom of Jerusalem and Saladin. In this movie, there's a line where it's the character Tiberius, who is supposedly based on Raymond III of Tripoli. But he's talking to Balian, and he says, between King Baldwin and Saladin, they could make a better world together. And the idea here is that there is this peace that Baldwin and Saladin have established for the sake of peace. Like, these are two rulers who do not like these conflicts of religion, and they would much rather it be a situation where everybody was just tolerant of each other. Now, of course, this is incorrect. The truth is that truces established between the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Muslim kingdoms were temporary, and they were designed so that either side could recover or have time that they needed to prepare for other things or attend to other things. Baldwin IV and Saladin were both committed to the supremacy of their faiths. They both were interested in conquering each other's territory. Saladin, as I said earlier, was a committed jihadist. His goal was ultimately to eliminate the Crusader presence in the Levant. Baldwin IV wanted to defend Jerusalem from Muslim control, and he wanted to, if possible, expand Crusader control eastward into Saladin's territory. And interestingly enough, this conflict between Reynald of Chatillon and King Baldwin IV that's shown in the movie is inaccurate because, in fact, they were cooperating. Reynald really was in line with Baldwin's policy of sort of hard-edged policy of taking the fight to the enemy. Reynald and Baldwin did have some disputes with one another, but they were not about this basic goal of, you know, realizing the ideal of the Crusades. Now, Reynald had policy aims of his own, and he engaged in raids against Saladin, and this is shown in the movie as just being like, he's just violent and greedy. But the truth is that raids were an important part of military strategy in this period of time in the Middle Ages, and especially in the Crusades. There were raids that went back and forth between the Muslims and the Christians. Now, of course, Reynald, there's no doubt about it, he was a very personally ambitious individual, and he could be a very ruthless individual. He did certainly have an interest in collecting booty and gaining wealth for himself, but he also had policy aims, and he wanted to defend his flank of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He was sort of in an exposed region in the Transjordan region beyond the Jordan, with his seat at the Castle of Kerak, which was one of the main eastern defenses of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But Saladin himself engaged in plenty of raids on the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which involved the burning of villages and, the destruction of crops and, the harming of peasants and their way of life, which interestingly, there probably would have been Muslim peasants as well, and that Saladin disrupted in his raids on the Kingdom of Jerusalem, because there were a lot of Muslims who lived in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But the point is that this way that the movie portrays, Reynald is just kind of this raiding meanie. Everybody engaged in raids. Both sides raided back and forth. Saladin used raids as a tool. So it distorts the history to portray things this way. The third major issue with Kingdom of Heaven historically is the relationship between Guy and the Princess Sibylla. So Guy of Lusignan was kind of this upstart knight who came from an important family, the Lusignan family. They were an important family back in the West. So he shows up and ends up becoming king of Jerusalem after the death of Sibylla's son, Baldwin V, in 1186. And the way this is portrayed in the film is that Guy is kind of this conniving, wicked, ambitious man who preys upon Sibylla's position and the fact that her son is going to need military support, and that basically Sibylla is not. She doesn't love Guy. She despises him, and part of this is because she hates the fact that he's this mean brute who wants to engage in war with the Muslims, and she, being a tolerant postmodern liberal, she thinks that's not nice. Of course, the truth is that Sibylla was very much in love with Guy. She very much willingly married him. Guy was an unexpected choice for her husband, but once they were married, there were problems that continued with the court's willingness to accept him. There were some clashes between Guy and Sibylla's brother, King Baldwin, and ultimately Baldwin tried to disinherit Sibylla and Guy and get them cut off from the avenue of the throne. But after his death, Sibylla herself engineered a coup in which she was able to get Guy and herself into the position of the monarchy, and Guy became king of Jerusalem. And this was something that she absolutely participated in, and was probably even one of the main actors in this. The Grand Master of the Templars at that time, Gerard of Ridderford, was one individual who was also involved in this. And we have a podcast where Helena Schroeder and I discuss in detail how this coup took place. If you're interested, I'll put a link below. But the point is that it's just so different from how this is portrayed in the film. And indeed, I think the actual history is quite a bit more interesting, because Sibylla was a woman who was quite in love and seemed to put the interests of her heart, that is, her devotion to Guy, ahead of the good of the kingdom. A lot of people around her didn't think Guy was the right choice. She wasn't interested in that just because she wanted to be with him, essentially. And indeed, later after the Battle of Hattin, when he was captured by Saladin, she followed him willingly into captivity. So this was a woman who was very much devoted to this man, in stark contrast to what we're presented with in Kingdom of Heaven. I think the idea that Guy is portrayed as kind of this psychopath in the movie Kingdom of Heaven, it's very incorrect too. Guy, from what we can tell, he was not a particularly hard-nosed individual. He wasn't. He didn't have a lot of force to his own personality. In fact, he was more easily manipulated. He was manipulated by the Grand Master of the Templars, Gerard of Ridderford, who really appears to have wanted Guy put in power because he felt that he could control him. And Gerard manipulated Guy to march out to the Battle of Hattin, whereas in Kingdom of Heaven, Guy is very much shown as, he's a psychopath. I mean, he there's this part where he looks at Reynald and says, "Give me a war." He's like got this bloodlust, and I think that's just a very inaccurate way to look at Guy. He wasn't like that. He had a much milder personality than that. He appreciated the good life. He wanted to advance, but he didn't have a lot of personal vision for what he was trying to achieve. And this was, in fact, his great downfall. He was really the first king of Jerusalem in the history of the Crusader states who was like that. The previous kings had very strong personalities and had been very good leaders. Guy was really not a good leader, and that's because of that the kingdom ended up in a point of disaster. The fourth great historical error in Kingdom of Heaven is Saladin's war aims. The movie shows Saladin again as kind of this reluctant warrior. He is pushed into this battle with the Crusaders because of just these unforgivable crimes committed by the Crusaders. One thing that's shown is that Reynald engages in this raid in which he kills Saladin's sister, and this particularly enrages Saladin. There's no historical basis for that. That didn't happen as far as we can tell. If it did happen, there's no historical trace of it. But yeah, Saladin always intended to conquer Jerusalem and to attack the Crusaders. He invaded the kingdom many times before his final decisive blow in 1187. He was thwarted during the reign of King Baldwin IV. Saladin was in general just a very ambitious guy. He came from fairly modest origins, and he made himself one of the great powers in the Levant, and this was done through his political genius and his abilities as a field commander. He was one of the most talented leaders and rulers of his day, and he didn't get to that point by just being kind of this, withdrawn, contemplative, poet king. Now that's kind of an attractive idea. People nowadays find that compelling, but it's just not consistent with the sort of personalities during this very tumultuous era that rose to power. And Saladin was one of the most noteworthy and capable personalities in the political scene at this time. He outdid so many very capable rivals. He outdid King Amalric of Jerusalem in taking control of Egypt. He outwitted his former master and sponsor, Nur ad-Din. He basically single-handedly eliminated the Zengid dynasty. That's Nur ad-Din's dynasty as a potent force in Syria. He was just a very ambitious and very capable guy. And his final goal, or one of his long-term goals, was always to get rid of the Crusader states, to just completely wipe them out. He made sure he had pretty much total control of the major Sunni powers in the region before he really took the fight to the Crusaders in a very serious way. Well, I guess I should kind of back that up a little bit. He did make some very serious invasions of the Kingdom of Jerusalem before he really took control of all of Muslim Syria, or really had it all under his thumb. But he did seem to make a greater effort towards subduing the great Sunni powers before he was willing to really push hard against the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But one thing we can make note of too is that one of our best sources for Saladin's life is this chronicler by the name of Baha ad-Din. Baha ad-Din was Saladin's personal servant, biographer, and friend. He had the title of Qadi of the army, so judge of the army, essentially, and a very prestigious person and someone who's very close to Saladin, and he wrote an account of Saladin's life that is probably our best window into Saladin's thoughts. And Baha ad-Din tells us that Saladin intended to completely eliminate the Crusader states, and he even told Saladin even told Baha ad-Din that he hoped to eliminate all of Christianity, essentially. This is kind of, might be more hyperbolic, but he said, I'd like to go across the sea, and after I've finished with the Crusaders here, go across the sea, which he's talking about going to Europe, and eliminate everyone who doesn't believe in Allah. So that's quite ambitious, and it kind of points to Saladin's jihadist spirit. When this idea that Saladin only attacked the Crusader kingdom because he was provoked, it's just not true. That was always his intention, and the idea of a broken treaty or something like that, that did happen. Treaties were broken on both sides. Saladin at times broke treaties he had with the Crusaders, but the idea of Reynald's raids as being some sort of, that's what got Saladin to do this. Well, that was a pretext, and that's one of the oldest pretexts in the book. Rulers are always looking for pretexts when they have something they want to. A campaign they want to engage in. There was something similar in Spain in the early 13th century when King Fernando III of Leon and Castile was very interested in conquering the Guadalquivir Valley to the south of Castile. He used some pretexts like that, broken treaties from the Muslims and that sort of thing to affect a campaign that he always intended to engage in. He always intended to conquer this territory because he had the ability to do it. And Saladin had a very good shot at conquering the kingdom of Jerusalem. He always intended to take that shot. So I think one of the most profoundly erroneous and ahistorical parts of Kingdom of Heaven is this part where Saladin is shown picking up a cross that had fallen on the floor and placing it on placing it in a place of honor. He didn't like the idea of the Christian religion being desecrated or insulted. That it's sort of a famous scene in Kingdom of Heaven. It was improvised by the actor who played Saladin, and it's a kind of it's a powerful scene, with the character that's created in Kingdom of Heaven as Saladin, but that character does not resemble the true Saladin. The fascinating thing is that Saladin did just the opposite. The historical Saladin, after Jerusalem fell to his armies, he had the great cross that was on top of one of the great churches in Jerusalem. He had it torn down and tied to the tail of a donkey and dragged through the streets of the city, basically, humiliating it. So it's very striking that the exact opposite of what Ridley Scott shows in the movie is the truth of what happened. I think the fifth and final great error in Kingdom of Heaven is the fact that it presents an erroneous concept of crusading. Basically a misrepresentation of Crusades theology. The idea is presented in the film that the religious motivation for the Crusades is insincere, that in fact this was just about land and power. This is very much untrue. Jonathan Riley Smith, one of the major historians of the Crusades, has pointed out that Crusaders basically had to spend a great deal of money and wealth and go to a lot of trouble, and it was very dangerous and expensive to go on crusading, and nobody really made any money doing this. There were a few people who went out there and kind of were able to make a bit of a fortune for themselves, but for the most part, this was expensive, this was difficult. People could have been a lot more wealthy and prosperous if they'd stayed home and focused on their lands and titles at home, but people still did this. And why did they do it? Well, they did it because of this profound religious motivation. There was this idea that this was the most honorable thing that a knight could do. He could go to the Holy Land and fight for God and fight for God's cause there. People expected great hardship and possibly even death. In fact, death was common for crusading knights. People still did it because of this strong spiritual motivation. Again, the theology that's shown is erroneous too. There's a part where this sort of crazed, glassy-eyed priest talks about how to kill an infidel is the path to heaven. So it's all about, killing. Well, crusading did involve killing, but that wasn't really the motivation behind it. And it wasn't like, oh, God just loves it when you kill these unbelievers. No, the idea was that, in fact, Bernard of Clairvaux talked about this. He said that it would be better if we didn't have to kill the Muslims and fight them in battle. It would be much better if we could, there was some other way to protect the Holy Land and reconquer the Holy Land. But because we must do that, that's going to be done. And it's an acceptable thing to do. The act of crusading, it was the repentance of sin and the vow to go on crusade, and then actually doing it, doing this thing to help other Christians and help defend Christ's holy places. This was where the spiritual merit came in the crusade. The act of killing a Muslim or an opponent while on crusade could be justified, but it wasn't that wherein lay the spiritual act, the holy act. So that's something that is misrepresented in the movie. But anyway, that's just some stuff I feel is worth noting about the movie Kingdom of Heaven. This is just a fairly brief podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will talk to you soon. I'd also like to say thanks to my latest Patreon supporters, Jonathan, Robert, Kit, Samuel, and Genu. Thanks so much, guys. I'm glad to have your support. And if you would like to support what Real Crusades History does as well, you can do so by clicking on the Patreon link below. You will find out the various rewards I offer to Patreon supporters. So thanks very much, guys. Take care.